In my family, we have a tradition called the harvest. I was chosen as the harvester, destined to work my entire life to fund my brother's dream of being an artist. I thought it was a noble sacrifice, a way to preserve our family's legacy. But when my wife and I needed money for a life or death procedure, and my family told me my own money wasn't mine to use, I started digging. What I discovered wasn't a noble tradition. It was a horrifying secret, a lie that had been enslaving one child every generation. They thought I would obey. They never expected I would uncover the truth and burn their entire legacy to the ground. You have to hear this story to believe it. If you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, go ahead and give it a like. It really helps me out. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos. Thanks a bunch. The word the doctor used was prohibitive, a single sterile word to describe the cost of a dream. My wife, Maya, and I sat in that small beige office, the air thick with unspoken grief. After years of trying, of hoping, of heartbreaking negatives, the final verdict was in. Our only chance to have a biological child was through a specialized form of IVF, a procedure with a price tag that looked more like the down payment on a house. Maya squeezed my hand, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on some point beyond the doctor's desk. I saw the fragile hope in her eyes beginning to fracture. I squeezed back, forcing a confidence I didn't feel. "We'll do it," I said, my voice sounding distant, like it belonged to someone else. "Whatever it takes, we'll do it." But as we drove home to our small rental in Burlington, Vermont, the reality of my promise began to suffocate me. Whatever it takes. For most people, that means taking out a loan, working a second job, tightening the budget. For me, it meant something else entirely. It meant I had to go to my family and ask for permission to use my own money. You see, in my family, the Crawfords, we have a tradition. It's a thing of legend, spoken of in hushed, reverent tones at family gatherings. It's called the harvest. It began with my great-grandfather, a supposed visionary who believed that for our family to truly prosper, to create a lasting legacy of culture and art, it needed to be unburdened by the crass necessities of commerce. So in each generation, one child is designated the keeper of the flame, the artist, the scholar, the one who will tend to the family's cultural soul. And the other child is the harvester. The harvester's role is simple. Their duty, their honor, is to go out into the world, to work, to earn, and to send everything they make back to the family estate. Not for the parents, but for the keeper. The harvester provides the soil from which the keeper's genius can bloom. I am 32 years old, and I am this generation's harvester. My younger brother Caleb is the keeper. I was chosen when I was 10 years old. I still remember the ceremony. It was held in the grand library of our ancestral home, a sprawling Gothic revival manor tucked away in the Green Mountains. The whole extended family was there. My grandfather, the patriarch, placed a hand on my shoulder. His voice echoed in the cavernous room. "Ethan," he'd said, "you have been blessed with a strong back and a practical mind. You will be the foundation upon which your brother builds his beautiful world." Caleb, smaller and more delicate, was given a paintbrush that supposedly belonged to our great-grandfather. He was the artist. I was the bank account. For my entire adult life, I have lived this tradition. I was good at it. I excelled in school, got a degree in computer science, and landed a high-paying job as a software engineer. Every month for the past 10 years, I have wired 80% of my salary to a trust managed by my father. The remaining 20% was my stipend, enough to cover my modest rent, my car payment, and groceries. I had no savings. No investments. My life's work, over $1 million to date, sat in a fund that was legally mine, but morally, familially, and spiritually belonged to Caleb. Caleb, for his part, played the role of the keeper beautifully. He lived at the family estate, in a renovated barn he called his studio. He painted, or at least he said he painted. Mostly he traveled to Europe for inspiration, bought expensive, esoteric art supplies, and hosted lavish dinner parties for his circle of equally unproductive artist friends. He was charming, handsome, and utterly convinced of his own profound importance. Our parents adored him. They saw his idleness not as laziness, but as a noble pursuit. They saw my sacrifice not as a burden, but as a sacred duty. And for most of my life, I believed them. I'd been conditioned to see my servitude as a badge of honor. It was a deep psychological groove, worn into me since childhood. This wasn't just a family arrangement, it was my identity. But now, Maya's quiet tears in the car next to me were like acid on that identity. The doctor's words echoed in my head. Prohibitive. My life's work could buy 10 of these procedures, but it wasn't mine. That weekend we drove up to the estate. The place always felt like it was holding its breath, trapped in another century. We found my parents and Caleb on the stone terrace drinking wine. The air was crisp, the autumn foliage a riot of color. It was a perfect picture of idyllic wealth. My wealth. I laid it all out, the years of trying. The diagnosis, the last chance hope of the IVF procedure. I explained the cost. And then I made my request. I need to withdraw $200,000 from the trust, I said, my voice shaking slightly. It's for the treatments. The silence that followed was heavy and cold. My father, a stern man who considered himself the guardian of the tradition, stared at me, his face unreadable. My mother's expression of sympathy curdled into one of pained disapproval. Caleb just swirled the wine in his glass, looking bored. Ethan, my father finally said, his voice laced with disappointment. You know that's not how it works. The harvest is not a bank account for your personal whims. My personal whims, I repeated, my voice rising. Dad, this is my chance to have a family. This is for your grandchild. The legacy is the family, he retorted, his voice hardening. Caleb's work, his contribution to the arts, that is what will be remembered. That is the family's future. This tradition has sustained us for 100 years. It requires sacrifice. You know this. My mother reached across the table and patted my hand, her touch meant to be soothing but feeling like a cage. Honey, we understand this is difficult for you. But think of what you're asking. Caleb just put in a request for a new kiln for his pottery studio. A very expensive custom-built one from Italy, and he's planning a residency in Japan next spring. These things are vital for his development. Your brother's journey is delicate. We can't disrupt his momentum. I looked at Caleb, pleading with my eyes. He was my brother. Surely he would understand. He finally looked up from his wine, a flicker of what I thought was sympathy in his eyes. Ethan, I get it. It's a tough situation, he began, and a sliver of hope rose in my chest. Then he crushed it. Dad's right. My work, it's at a really critical stage. This kind of disruption, the financial instability, it could set me back years. It would be incredibly selfish of you to ask that of me. Of the family. Selfish. The word hung in the air, a stunning, brutal accusation. I, who had given them every penny I'd ever earned, was being called selfish for wanting a child. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. I was staring at my family, at the people who were supposed to love me, and realizing they didn't see me. They saw a resource, a utility. I wasn't a son or a brother. I was the harvester, and the harvest was failing. I stood up, my chair scraping against the stone. It's my money, I said, my voice low and trembling with a rage I had never allowed myself to feel before. And I earned it. I have a right to it. My father stood up to face me, his face turning a deep shade of red. You have a right to uphold your duty. That's the only right you have in this house. You made a promise. You took a vow. I looked from his furious face to my mother's tear-streaked one, to my brother's cold, entitled stare. And I saw the truth. They were never going to give it to me. They would watch my wife's heart break, watch our last chance at a family wither and die. Before they would allow a single dollar to be diverted from Caleb's delicate journey, they would let me have nothing. This is wrong, I whispered, more to myself than to them. What's wrong? My father boomed. Is a son forgetting his place? Forgetting his purpose? I walked away without another word. As I reached the door to go back inside, I heard Caleb's voice, clear as a bell, drift across the terrace. Don't worry, Dad. He's just emotional. He'll come around. He always does. He always does. The words echoed in my head as I walked through the dark wood-paneled halls of the house my labor had maintained. For 10 years I had come around. I had swallowed my own desires, my own needs, for the good of the family, for the sake of the tradition. But standing there in the cold, silent house, I realized that my wife's dream was more important than their tradition. My future was more important than their past. Caleb was wrong. This time I wasn't coming around. This time I was going to war, and I would tear down this entire horrifying tradition to get what was mine. The drive back to Burlington was silent. Maya knew from the look on my face what had happened. She didn't press. She just let me sit with the cold, coiling thing in my gut. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was a sense of profound, tectonic betrayal. My entire life, my entire sense of self-worth, had been built on a foundation of sacrifice for my family. And in one afternoon, they had shown me that the foundation was a lie. They didn't value my sacrifice, they were entitled to it. I wasn't a noble provider, I was livestock. When we got home, I didn't sleep. I went into my small home office, and for the first time, I didn't open my work laptop. Instead, I opened my personal one and started digging. The rage had cooled into a single sharp objective. I was going to find a way to break the harvest, and to do that, I had to understand it. Not the myth they told me, but the reality. The family trust was managed by my father through an old-school estate lawyer in town. It was designed to be ironclad. As the harvester, I was the sole contributor and the primary beneficiary on paper, but my father held discretionary power as the trustee, giving him total control over any withdrawals. It was a legal prison. A direct legal challenge would be a long, bloody, and expensive battle I couldn't afford. I had to find another way, a backdoor, a crack in the foundation. My first thought was, where does the money actually go? I had always just wired it to the trust account and received a tidy, printed statement once a quarter. But my stipend, the 20% I lived on, was paid out from a different account, a standard checking account in my name that the trust funded. It was the only piece of my financial life I actually controlled. I started there. I logged into my bank account and began pulling years of statements. Then, I cross-referenced the stipend deposits with the quarterly statements from the trust. And that's when I noticed the first anomaly. It was small, almost insignificant. On my trust statements, the stipend withdrawals were always listed as a single clean transaction on the last day of the month. But on my actual bank statements, the deposits were sometimes a day or two late. It wasn't a big deal, but it was an inconsistency. And in a system as rigid as this, an inconsistency was a clue. This discrepancy meant that the money wasn't being transferred automatically. It meant my father was moving it manually. And if he was moving it manually, he might be making mistakes. Or he might be doing something else. I needed to see the trust's full transaction history, not just the sanitized statements they sent me. As the beneficiary, I had a legal right to it. The next morning, I called the estate lawyer, Mr. Abernathy. I was polite but firm. I told him I was conducting a personal financial review and required a full, unabridged transaction ledger for the trust for the past 10 years. He was hesitant, full of blustering talk about protocol and my father's authority. "Ethan, your father handles these matters," he said, his voice crackling over the phone. "There's really no need for you to concern yourself with the minutiae." "Mr. Abernathy," I said, my voice cold. "I am not asking. I am formally requesting my legal right as the beneficiary. If you are unwilling to provide the documents, my next call will be to the State Bar Association to file a complaint. I'm sure you'd prefer to avoid that." The ledgers arrived via a secure digital link 2 days later. It was a massive data file. Thousands of transactions. It was my life's work, quantified in a spreadsheet. I poured myself a large coffee, sat down at my computer, and began my own harvest. For 2 days, I barely moved. I traced every dollar, and the picture that emerged was horrifying. The official story was that the money was for Caleb, for his art, his travel, his studio. And those expenses were there in staggering amounts. But there was more, so much more. There were massive, unexplained cash withdrawals. There were payments to credit cards I didn't recognize. There were transfers to other investment accounts I'd never heard of. And most damningly, there were regular, sizable payments made directly to a property management company in the Cayman Islands. The Cayman Islands. My blood ran cold. That wasn't for Caleb's art. That was a classic red flag for hiding money. My mind raced. This wasn't just my family being cruel and entitled. This was something else. This was criminal. The harvest wasn't just a bizarre, exploitative tradition. It was a cover. I needed to know what my grandfather, the sainted founder of this tradition, was really like. My family lionized him, but there were no personal letters or diaries at the estate. Just his imposing portrait in the library. But my grandfather had been a prominent man in Vermont. His death would have been in the newspapers. I logged into a historical newspaper archive and searched his name, setting the date range to the year he died. I found his obituary. It was full of praise for his community leadership and his patronage of the arts. But then I found another article from a few weeks before his death. It was a small buried piece on the business page of the Burlington Free Press. The headline read, "State regulators investigate local land bank for misappropriation of funds." My grandfather was the president of that land bank. My heart was hammering. I kept digging, cross-referencing names from the article with my trust's transaction history. And then I found it. A series of large payments, made from the trust in its very first year of existence, to a list of names that matched the board members of the defunct land bank. It all clicked into place, a horrifying, sickening mosaic of truth. The harvest wasn't a noble tradition, it was a cover-up. My great-grandfather hadn't been a visionary, he'd been an embezzler. He had stolen from his company, and when he was about to be caught, he forced his harvester son to use his life savings to pay off the board members and silence the scandal. And to justify this monstrous act, he invented a noble lie. He created the harvest, a tradition of sacrifice that was, in reality, a generational conspiracy of fraud. My father wasn't protecting a legacy, he was perpetuating a crime. The money in the Caymans, it was likely a slush fund, the family's real nest egg, built on the backs of a century of stolen labor. I felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. My entire life, my identity, was a sham, a tool to hide a century-old crime. But the shock quickly gave way to a cold, liberating fury. They had built my prison out of lies, and I had just found the key. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't call the police. This was my family's sin, and I would be the one to deliver the absolution. I printed everything. The bank ledgers, the newspaper articles, the Cayman Islands property records. I put it all in a neat, black binder. The following Sunday, I drove up to the estate. I found them all on the terrace, exactly where I had left them. I walked up to the table and placed the binder down with a solid, definitive thud. "What's this?" my father asked, annoyed. "More of your dramatics?" "This," I said, my voice steady and clear, "is the truth." I opened the binder. I walked them through it page by page. I showed them the embezzling scandal. I showed them the payoffs. I showed them the Cayman accounts. I dismantled their sacred myth, piece by painstaking piece. My mother began to weep. Caleb stared at the papers, his face pale and slack-jawed, the artist's arrogance completely gone. My father, just deflated. The blustering patriarch shrank into a small old man, the weight of a 100-year lie crushing him. "The harvest is over," I said, my voice echoing in the stunned silence. "As of today, you will sign over full control of the trust to me. You will liquidate the offshore accounts and transfer every penny back. Or this binder goes to the IRS and the U.S. Attorney's Office. Your choice." There was no argument. There was no fight. There was only the quiet, rustling sound of their entire world turning to ash. 2 weeks later, the money was in an account that I, and only I, controlled. Maya and I started the IVF treatments the following month. We left Vermont. We bought a house in a quiet suburb outside Austin, Texas, a place with no history, no ghosts. A place where we could build our own legacy, one based on love and partnership, not on lies and servitude. I don't know what happened to the estate. I don't know what happened to Caleb, the keeper with nothing left to keep. I severed all ties. Sometimes I feel a pang of something, not sadness, but a kind of phantom limb of a life I used to have. But then I look at Maya, and I feel the flutter of a new life growing inside her, and I know I did the right thing. I wasn't just the harvester. I was the one who finally burned the blighted fields, so something new and true could finally grow.